This video will help you understand the impact of required minimum distributions if you name a trust as a beneficiary on your retirement account. If you don't know who I am, my name is Chris Dime. I'm a certified financial planner out of Edmonds, Washington, and I specialize in working with folks to and through retirement. In the normal coursework of doing financial planning for clients, if they're gonna open up a retirement account of some kind, whether it's a 401k or IRA, they'll be given the option as to who they want to elect as their beneficiaries, both primary and contingent. In addition, as we're reviewing estate plans for clients and they have established retirement accounts, this is part of the audit. Who's the primary and who is listed as contingent? To keep it simple, the primary beneficiary is who gets first right of refusal to this money if you pass away, and the contingent beneficiaries are those who are next in line to receive this money if the primary beneficiary is no longer with us, or the primary beneficiary decides to disclaim these assets during probate. And disclaiming is just a fancy estate planning term for saying no to when you are going to bequest them funds. Now, most people, if they're married with kids, are going to pick their spouse as the primary beneficiary, and the kiddos would be split as contingent beneficiaries. Now, whether or not you have a spouse and kiddos or whatever, you might choose to elect your primary and contingent beneficiaries to be different than that. You might elect a charity as a beneficiary. You might elect a friend down the street or whatever. And in a final situation, you might elect a trust as a beneficiary inside this retirement account. We'll have to talk another time about which trusts make sense to set up in which situations to get the best results. However, to keep it simple, in today's video, we'll talk about how required minimum distributions get factored in for those who elect to name a trust as one of the beneficiaries. So let's jump in. So why would you set up a trust to inherit money in the first place? Well, to keep it simple, if outright naming an individual as a beneficiary would not be in their best interest or in the wills of the decedent, then you might look into setting up a trust to maintain a little bit more control after you've gone to make sure that the financial instrument is being managed prudently. Now, if you just want your spouse to get the money outright, you'd name him or her as primary beneficiary. And if you just want the kiddos to get a 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 split, you would set up 3 contingent beneficiaries in this scenario. But if you want to maintain a little bit more control, you'd name a trust. Now, it's not too hard to imagine scenarios where you might want to maintain a little bit more financial control over these instruments once you're gone. Namely, number one, let's say the person that you'd like to have the money has a history of making poor financial decisions, or they're just incredibly young. You might not want to disenfranchise their financial future by giving them access to a bunch of money all at once. You might elect to set up what's called a conduit trust or an accumulation trust that levels out distributions over a longer time horizon, or only gives elective distributions to the beneficiary if the trustee says that it's in their best interest. And whether or not the person that you're actually bequesting the money to has a history of making good or bad financial decisions, they might be married to someone who has a history of making good or bad financial decisions, and you wouldn't want to jeopardize the funds you're giving to your beneficiary knowing that their spouse, getting wind of having access to this money, might be motivated to go make some poor financial decisions. And one other scenario that could make sense is if the person you're passing the money to is an individual with special needs. We know that if you outright give a bunch of money to somebody with special needs, you could very much disenfranchise that individual from all the government benefits that they're afforded. So, and we'll talk about this later on in the video, it might make sense to name a trust, and for special needs folks, this is a certain type of trust we'll talk about in a second. You might seek to name a trust as a beneficiary in this situation. So how do required minimum distributions factor into things? Well, we know the IRS has 3 different categories for beneficiaries: eligible designated beneficiaries, non-eligible designated beneficiaries, and then non-designated beneficiaries. As a quick reminder, EDBs are folks who are either the spouse of the decedent, maybe they're an individual who's not less than 10 years younger than that individual, or they are a minor child, they're chronically ill, or they're disabled. One of those 5 options, you'd be considered an EDB. And you've got your own required minimum distribution rules, which I'll come out with some future videos on how those break down. The other category are NEDBs. This is essentially everybody else. And the last category are non-designated beneficiaries. And this is essentially every beneficiary type that isn't a human person. So for example, if you name a charity as a beneficiary, then that charity is considered a non-designated beneficiary, and they've got their own specific required minimum distribution rules. We're gonna keep it high level today, and I'm gonna reference these 3 categories depending on how the trust is set up. For more information on the specifics to how that category of beneficiary will need to treat required minimum distributions, see either my previous video or I'm going to come up with some future ones that could be helpful in laying it all out, as there's been quite a few changes relative to how to interpret legislation. To keep it simple, as long as the trust is established as a qualified look-through trust, again, commonly referred to as a conduit trust or accumulation trust, then The beneficiaries are who dictate what type of required minimum distribution schedule applies. And if there are multiple beneficiaries, generally the oldest of all the beneficiaries is who the required minimum distribution schedule applies to on behalf of everybody else. They will need to withdraw a much larger percentage of a retirement account if they have required minimum distributions. If for whatever reason the trust does not pass the bar of being considered a qualified look-through trust, then the trust is considered a non-qualified trust. If the trust is considered a non-qualified trust, then that trust must follow the non-designated beneficiary required minimum distribution rules. So some low-hanging fruit as an example here. If you set up a trust to receive your retirement account when you pass away, and the trust solely has a charity listed as a beneficiary in the trust, then that trust must follow the non-designated beneficiary required minimum distribution schedule. But what are some of the most common trust scenarios where there's actually people listed as beneficiaries on these trusts? Again, let's assume for these examples that all of these trusts are considered qualified look-through trusts. A very simple solution is if you have one eligible designated beneficiary listed as the beneficiary for that trust, then the trust follows those EDB required minimum distribution schedules. That's pretty easy. Same thing if the only beneficiary listed on this trust is a non-eligible designated beneficiary, then they would follow the non-eligible designated beneficiary required minimum distribution rules. A more complicated scenario would be if you have multiple beneficiaries listed as beneficiaries for this particular trust that's inheriting the retirement account. If they're all eligible designated beneficiaries, generally that means that the oldest eligible designated beneficiary will need to follow their required minimum distribution schedule, which is generally a little bit disadvantageous for the younger folks who might have a more liberal required minimum distribution schedule. They would simply have to fall in line with whatever the oldest required minimum distribution schedule is. Likewise, a more complicated scenario is if you have multiple beneficiaries listed on a trust and they are all non-eligible designated beneficiaries. Same thing, you'd follow the oldest's required minimum distribution schedule. This sort of complication and disadvantageous move is generally why it's recommended to have multiple conduit or accumulation trusts, specifically one for each beneficiary you're passing the funds to, so as not to disenfranchise, say, the younger beneficiaries from the age of the older beneficiaries inside this trust. In another further complicated situation, let's say the beneficiaries of whatever trust you set up is a combination of both eligible designated beneficiaries and non-eligible designated beneficiaries. The literature isn't perfectly clear on this, but it would appear as if the required minimum distribution schedule for that trust will follow the oldest non-eligible designated beneficiary. And this very much disenfranchises the financial best interest of the younger beneficiaries. Namely, if they're younger, they'd have smaller RMDs, but also if they're eligible designated beneficiaries, they miss out on some more liberal required minimum distribution schedule treatment. Again, that's why it's strongly encouraged to set up individual trusts for individual beneficiaries to receive these funds. Now, what about for trusts relative to those with special needs? So as we touched on earlier, outright bequesting money to an individual with special needs oftentimes might seem great, but is not actually in their financial best interest, because the way that the rules are set up today, if the individual with special needs meets a particular threshold of assets that they have liquid available to them in, say, like a bank account, they might get kicked off a number of the government benefits that are meant to help out individuals with special needs who are at a low income, namely things like supplemental security income, as well as Social Security disability income. So generally, outright just giving money to an individual with special needs is a no-go. Luckily, the Secure Act established what's called a Type 2 AMBT, which stands for Applicable Multi-Beneficiary Trust. These types of trusts are great for folks with special needs because what it allows the retirement assets to do is to go into this trust, and then, as opposed to sending distributions to the individual special needs, whether they need it or not, we don't want to kick them off those benefits. The trust is allowed to accumulate those benefits, only distribute what makes sense to that individual special needs. And a rapid distribution and required minimum distribution schedule only applies once the beneficiary within that AMBT that has special needs, once they pass away. It's called a multi-beneficiary trust because generally you'll name multiple beneficiaries inside this trust. Some might have special needs and some might not. And once the individual with special needs passes away, then the 10-year rule applies to the other beneficiaries at that point, and they have to start making required minimum distributions and distributions out of the account based on that. So hopefully that was helpful in clarifying what the consequences related to required minimum distributions are if you name a trust as a beneficiary on your retirement account. I would say if your situation is more complicated than having individually named beneficiaries on your retirement account, and you are looking to designate a trust as a beneficiary, it's probably going to be worth your while to look to seek the guidance of a competent estate planning attorney, especially if whatever trust you're trying to use for this has multiple beneficiaries. If there's individual beneficiaries, it's a little bit easier to figure out, but again, you'd need to make sure that it's a qualified trust, and for that, it's probably going to pay to seek the guidance of a professional. So hope that was helpful. If you have further questions, drop them in the comments below or get in touch on the website. Have an awesome rest of the day. We'll chat with you later. Bye.